So for those of you that don't know me, or I don't know you, I'm Mike Metzger. I'm the Vice President of Agriculture and Research for Mindac Farmers Cooperative, the sugar beet processing co-op down in Wapaton, North Dakota. So clearly, one of these three things is not like the other two up here, so I was a sugar beet guy on an IDC panel. Just here to provide any general comments or questions you guys may have of how some of the growers that raise sugar beets for our co-op deal with IDC on the beans in their rotation, and certainly specific to any of the residual nitrates that may be lingering away that could be harmful to the beet crop.
Earlier today we heard where this ag price came out and something like 30-some% the test results came back plus 80 pounds of residual nitrogen. I was just curious if any of you three know when those tests were likely taken, and is it possible that those numbers aren't quite as high enough because we had so much growth from volunteer wheat going into the freeze-up. A lot of it was heading, if not headed already. So I'm wondering, how much can volunteer wheat gobble up that nitrogen then in the fall when you have growth like that?
Yeah, so a lot. So if it was taken right behind the combine, and you had 80, 100 pounds of N or something like that, and then you let the volunteers grow, I would be very, very confident that at least 50 pounds of that nitrogen is not going to be available this next year. One of the things we found with our cover crop studies is that it doesn't release the next year. It just doesn't release at all. So I would divide it in half probably, or take 50 pounds off or so, and go with that.
Where's that end going? I mean, if it's not releasing, it's getting, you're recycling some of this, right? Is it just, it's still being tied up?
No, it turns into a ghost, and you lose it about Halloween. No. So this is a big question, and I think in a lot of people's mind it's still a big question, and I'm not 100% sure this is happening, but I'm like 98% sure. So we don't see it in the nitrate. We don't see it next year. And so what the heck? So we're just come off that potassium study that had the illite smectide ratios and stuff because the potassium's being fixed. Well, back in the 40s and 50s, before people really started putting on nitrogen fertilizer, there's a fair amount of research on non-exchangeable ammonium. And ammonia has about the same ionic radius as potassium does. We have smectic soils. And so I thought that maybe that ammonium is being fixed just like potassium is. And so we ran that analysis on some of our sites, and yes, after the cover crops, one situation was after volunteer winter wheat, a little bit of flax and some field peas and some radishes, and 5,000 pounds of dry matter and 100 pounds of nitrogen taken up in that cover crop. That was about 100 pounds more nitrogen as non-exchangeable ammonium in that study than there was in the no cover crop plot. So I think that at the nano level, at the level where the clay particles are in intimate contact, either at the roots or with the decomposing residue, that is just being taken up right into the clay particles. And so we've tracked that over 4 seasons. And the first year we don't get any nitrogen out of that cover crop. The second year it appears that if we get a little bit, and then the third year we get a little bit more, and then by the fourth year it's kind of recycling and it's releasing like we think it's supposed to do. And it's not mineralization, but it's nitrogen being released from the non-exchangeable in between the clay layers. So that's what I think's happening.
Can you expand on that earlier comment? You were talking about the nitrogen from the cover crops taking 3 to 4 years to be released. If you grow a cover crop repeatedly, a system of no-till and cover crops for bitter ag,
Yes.
how would that nitrogen release be then? Would you see it on a continuous basis from that?
Well, that's a good question, because the money run out on that project. So that's a hell of some of these 3-4 year projects. So yeah, I guess just just been able to do it 4 years and seeing it eventually comes out, because it's not. A lot of people have seen this. I mean, out of Wisconsin, the first published paper on it, Matt Rourke at the University of Wisconsin. Radish and rye, same thing. Nitrogen didn't come out the next year. He didn't follow it through. We were lucky enough to be able to follow it through for 4 years and could see that it eventually is going to come out. So I don't know if the interlayers are just becoming a little bit more saturated. Let me see. How
But if you
people
have a
want to get into
cover
this.
crop next year, you've got a new set of N that's cycling. So
So
you're,
that's what the study is
Yep.
that, you know, there's cover crop each year during the 4 years, and you're eventually, I don't know, saturating the smectites. There's quite a bit of evidence from a couple different sources. One was my ex-PhD professor who worked on the moral plots with a French professor that could do the smectite illite determination, which again is not an easy thing. And they saw that when they didn't apply potash over a long period of time, you know, those moral plots are, 140 years old, something like that. So when they didn't put it on, they produced smectites. They depleted the soil of potassium that holds the illites together, and made smectites of smectitic type clay out of them. But in the areas where they added potash all the time, those clays were still illites. And a Chinese study also found that they could deplete an illite and make a smectite and add potassium, and so you make one clay into another clay. And so maybe that's what's happening during this cover crop thing, is you're kind of saturating the inner layers of the smectites that are barely smectites and used to be illites, and it's kind of pushing them toward the more illite thing, where they don't really care if they're wet or dry. They spit this stuff out all the time. So maybe that's what's happening. That's conjecture, but that seems reasonable to me.
This question is related to a previous question, and got me thinking about what unusual thing that happened last fall on the soybean stubble field, where you got wheat volunteer growing on the soybean stubble field, and would I still get a credit for the soybean stubble, or nitrogen credit for the soybean stubble, or would the wheat volunteer use up that credit?
Yeah, so it really depends. So the question was, if you had soybeans and then you had some kind of cover crop after the soybeans, is that going to negate whatever the credit is for the soybeans? So one of the things to consider and to really realize is that the soybean N credit doesn't come from the decomposition of the residue. It doesn't really have anything to do with that at all. It comes from two different sources. One is there's always nitrogen being released from the soil all the time. Huh? Oh, eat the mind. All right, so there's nitrogen being released from the soil all the time. And if you have a high residue crop that's low in nitrogen, like wheat straw, corn stalks, something like that, then you don't realize that nitrogen that's being released all the time. But if you have something like soybeans, where the residue, the amount of residue is a lot less, and the nitrogen content is a little bit higher, but not enough to release, you know, you're still getting the soil nitrogen to be expressed. The other thing is, it comes from a University of Wisconsin study from Larry Bundy, who died, 15, 20 years ago, but he came up to North Dakota and talked about this at one of our meetings, that under soybeans, the rhizosphere encourages and stimulates natural nitrogen mineralization in the spring. You know, and so there's more nitrogen, the speed of what that happens is happening in the spring. So the expression of the nitrate is happening, that's why it's a credit, and why you don't see it in the soil test. It's not happening in the fall. It happens in the spring during that flush of early growth. So I would kill it fairly early, unless you know the nitrate is really high, and that way the credit is still going to happen later on. It's not being tied up in the residue. if you have, let's say, rye sown in the soybean stubble, and I don't know what you would go to, you certainly wouldn't go to wheat next year, and corn would be problematic too. You know, maybe beets, for example, then you wouldn't get as much from that because that rye is going to continue to grow during that period of time where the soil is starting to mineralize. But in a spring kind of seeded cover crop situation, or if you kill it pretty early, I think you'd still, well, I know you would, you'd still receive the benefit of that 40 pounds.
And if I could just add one little caveat to that, is this is all related to biomass of that cover. So if you have a few little wheat sprigs here and there, it's not going to do anything for you. What we're talking about is multiple tons per acre. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, if I just had a few hundred pounds put out there, just scattered here and there, I wouldn't worry about it. If you had a pretty good stand, you know, and it got some height on it, then yeah, that might make a good difference.
Quick question, or I guess Mike, do folks seem to be worrying about their deep ground following wheat, the residual nitrates going in those fields?
No. So you guys up here in what we call the valley up here are in somewhat of a unique situation in that most of your sugar beet acres follow wheat. That's about it does make a difference. Okay. You guys are in a very unique situation up here where most of your sugar beet acres follow wheat. The reason you guys do that is that produces the highest quality sugar beets. In Mid-Dak, for example, in southern Mid, much more so. In Mid-Dak, 40% of our acres follow corn, another 30% to 35% follow soybean. And so we have very few small grains in rotation. We encourage guys to put behind wheat. Residual nitrate, there's just so many benefits to doing so. From breaking up any of the disease cycles out there, just from a different portfolio of weed herbicides that you have to use, it's really a good thing. In fact, just looking at our ag database and going across everything that we've done in the last 15 years, all of our beet payments, all the different inputs, everything that goes into the beets, just looking at the variable of preceding crop, you are, at Mid-Dak anyway, you are losing $162 an acre by putting them behind corn and $175 an acre behind soybeans. I mean, that's real money when it comes to that. So wheat ahead of beets is a very good thing. Potatoes even better.
I've just got a planting rate question. Earlier in one of the talks, we were talking about the spacing with the row, and then I heard earlier you talking about IDC and how it's better to increase the population in row. So then I guess I'm seeing a conflict of it's better to have the rows closer together than if you want to increase.
I got you. So the question is about the question about population driving IDC, and these plants are helping each other. The soybean plants are helping each other, probably not unlike what the companion crops, if we have oat or cover crop, is doing, soaking up some more of that extra N around each other. So there is there's a spatial component to this. So the tighter we have soybeans packed together, they actually help bring each other up. The issue with that is that you really only get close, and we're only talking about they need to be an inch or two apart, and we don't have soybeans an inch or two apart behind an air seeder or with drill. So that caveat comes from that piece, is if you're already in rows, you have an opportunity to pack them in a little bit closer, and either 22s or 30s, you can probably increase populations a little bit, and those soybeans will tend to help each other a little. And that's kind of part of what the question we're at with our study too, is that to see how much, what's the economic benefit of that extra seed at high seed costs relative to another pound of iron chelate, for instance. So where do we get the most bang for the buck? The population thing, in my experience, is there. It's real. We get a little bit of benefit, but you got to put on significant amounts of seed. I mean, from 125 to 175, we can see some small differences. But that's another 50,000 you've got out there. That's what, 20 bucks or something like that. So that's not an inexpensive proposition. So.
Yeah, whenever I start talking about wider rows, decrease in IDC, which it does, the weed people just want to crucify me, because that's the other part of it. You want to, it's hard enough with weed control these days anyway. And so I would before I throw my drill away and go to row soybeans, I would try the better varieties from the NDSU variety trials. They have all the North Dakota type IDC. I mean, they don't come from Iowa. They came from studies here in the state with our problems on it. So I would do that. And Jay Goose, who's retired now, his top 3 ways to fight IDC is, let me see, number 1 was variety, number 2 was variety, and number 3 was variety. And then we get down to the other thing.
And he was a soil scientist.
And he was a soil scientist, so that tells you how important that is. So I would attack those things before I would even think about.
And there's a yield hit. So there's a weed side of it, but there's also, you're going to lose 5 or 10% on yield going from wide rows to something narrow. So it has to be factored in.
If there's no final questions, thank you all for coming today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Seth.
Thank you.
If
That was
you
fun.